You are listening to Eastman's Flycast, an adventure fly fishing specific podcast covering travel, tactics, and next level insight. Now your host, Brian Barney.
Yo, what's happening, guys? Got a brand new Eastman's Flycast for you. So this week on the podcast, I have on Santino Castellanos. So I just met Santino. I met him through a friend. I met him through Lane Walters. It's actually the first I heard of him. And me and Lane were both in Alaska at the same time. I was hunting caribou, and Lane was photographing a Dall sheep hunt for Santino. And so that's the first I heard of him. I've been following his social media ever since. The guy's just a diehard fly fisherman, big game hunter, and just a great all-around guy. I love how he's introducing his kids into fly fishing and into hunting and things, and we discussed that on the podcast. But I just had some great conversations leading up to this podcast and then on this podcast. He's just super passionate, super knowledgeable, and a creative thinker. He thinks outside the box, which I really like. So we had this great conversation. We'll get right into it. I just want to thank my sponsor real quick. I want to thank Avid Max. So Avid Max, their internet store where you can get all your fly fishing needs. They have absolutely everything on there, from apparel to flies, rods, lines. They even have camping gear, anything for your dog as far as dog breads, dog training. They have it all at Avid Max. So I've been doing all my shopping there. I'm getting ready for a steelhead trip this winter. So I'm getting some new lines on my riggings on there, and also looking at some of their streamers on sale. Yeah, their clearance rack is off the hook. They always have stuff on their clearance rack and a lot of really good items. So that's a great place to start. But I really want to thank Avid Max for their support. We have a promo code here on Eastman's Flycast. So if you just enter Eastman's 10 in at checkout, you receive 10% off your order. So thanks to those guys at Avid Max for their support. And man, yeah, just a great podcast with Santino. I really like connecting with him. My next move is to get him on the Eastman's Elevated podcast. So that's my hunting specific podcast. On there, he'll be a great guest for that, as he was a great guest today on Flycast. And I really want to get together with this guy and do some fishing. So you'll kind of hear that throughout the podcast. We kind of tease as I want him to come up here and fish, and he invites me down there. But I just love these great people I get to meet through the podcast and connect with, and then also build friendships with. So a great guest, a great podcast. So this is Santino Castellanos, Eastman's Flycast. I'm your host, Brian Barney. Here we go. So I'm live with Santino, my new friend. Man, thanks, Santino, for taking the time.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Man, it's awesome to get you on Flycast. I see you fishing a lot there in your home. Where do you reside at, Santino?
So I'm just northwest out of Denver, basically between Boulder and Denver, in a small town called Lafayette, Colorado. I was born and raised in Westminster, which is just about 15 minutes down the road, but moved up north further north about 7 years ago, just for, I would just say, better quality of life, better school system, and all that kind of stuff for our sons. I have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old now, which is just crazy to say, but they're both in high school. And before I head west and head up to the mountains, we're just, enjoying a little bit more front range time. I'm over it, but it's been a great community, and it's a good place to raise a family for sure.
Yeah, how cool. Yeah, I love following along on your social media, all the fun stuff that you do with your boys and introducing them to the outdoor lifestyle. Your boys love to hunt and fish, don't they?
Yeah, it's something that, just because of the lifestyle that I've always lived, and even with my wife, that was a big part of our relationship when we first started dating, was going fishing and hunting, camping, and just enjoying the outdoors. So when we got married and started having kids right off the bat, they were pretty much just thrown into that. And the great news is that they both love it. And they've really just adapted the lifestyle, and it's really cool to see them grow into it for themselves, which is awesome.
Yeah, there's like a step that we all take where you kind of have mentors and you start following along and doing what they're doing, but it's a transition that you make to get really hungry for yourself or hungry for that knowledge to almost transition into your own style of fishing. Would you say your boys are there now, huh?
Yeah, for sure. So Jaron's my youngest, and he's my mini me, and he still kind of just follows dad as far as like style, how I do things, and I would say anything I say for him is king versus Aiden, my oldest. I think he started tying flies, man, when he was right around 9 years old. I think is when we got him his first fly tying kit, and he just grew into he took on this whole different shape, almost to the point when he was like 12 years old, we'd be on the river and he just said, Dad, I'm going to go down and I'm going to fish by myself. And, I was like, okay, do your thing. And it took him a few years to have success, but he just wants to figure it out his way, which is completely fine. But at the same time, that's something that I've always admired about my oldest son. And when it comes to fishing, that he has a way that he wants to do it. And he's basically gotten this foundation for me, and now he's making it his own, which is awesome.
Man, how cool. You guys are just coming into your fall winter season. You do quite a bit of your fishing in the winter, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Usually the late summer, fall, like right around now, is pretty much taken over by hunting. We did just get back from again, Aiden for his birthday wanted to go fishing, and usually every year it's kind of become tradition that the salmon start running in certain parts of Colorado. And we go to these rivers where you see them and they're moving up, and they're held up in these big pockets and groups, and it's just a blast. Because I think on Saturday, even though it was combat fishing, there was a lot of people out enjoying the great weather. We still hooked between the four of us probably 60, 65 fish as a family. It was awesome.
Oh, wow. What type of salmon? Where are they running up from?
So the place that we go, that it's kind of become our home base for going. There's several different parts. You can go all the way to southwestern Colorado, like Gunnison, but the kokanee salmon, they start moving up. From 11 Mile Reservoir, which is just right there in South Park. So 11 Mile Reservoir comes into there. It's a gold medal water that everyone's familiar with. They call it the Dream Stream. And basically there's two reservoirs. There's Spinney Reservoir, and where that's dammed up and that tailwater comes out and goes into 11 Mile, that's known for catching really, really good fish at certain times of the year. So that's an area we just like going to, because usually on the way down there, it's around first rifle, second rifle season. So you see critters moving around everywhere. And like just on the drive up and the drive back, we saw elk, and we saw a really nice bighorn that we were able to take some photos of. And it's just a beautiful place.
Man, how cool. Those kokanee, I haven't caught those for a long time. They had them in Washington and would have them on some lakes and stuff, but I don't think I've heard of them running up those river systems. Boy, that sounds like fun. Those kokanee are a real bright silver fish. They're hard fighting too, right?
Well, they are silver, but by the time we're catching them, pretty much the only thing that's silver on them is their heads. And, everybody, it's funny because a lot of people do not think of catching salmon in Colorado. They think of Alaska. They think of all these other different places, which makes sense. But when I was a kid up north, I'm sure you're familiar with Colorado pretty well, but up just north of Silverthorne, there's Green Mountain Reservoir, and that tailwater, you'll just see guys with buckets that are throwing out these big snagging hooks, and obviously, they're moving upstream to die, right? So I think when I was a kid, I don't know, I think it was probably like 35 or 40 fish a day that you could take. And I never actually had success doing that, just because I think we used to go first or second rifle season, and then we would try to go, salmon fit or snagging is what we called it after that. And we never had a lot of success. It really wasn't until we started fishing or fly fishing and going down to these tailwaters where you can actually see them spawn. You're looking at the fish that you're pretty much casting to, and that's more the style of fishing I like. That's when we started really being able to have success catching those.
That sight fishing, that's a fun way to fish. looking into the water. It's a skill that you have to kind of hone looking for fish, and that's whether it's saltwater or salmon or steelhead. I know I've sight fished to steelhead before, and then big trout as well. But being able to see them there and then present your fly through there and watch them eat, there is nothing funner than that.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's just because I love hunting so much. To me, that style of fishing is like hunting, because you're seeing what you're going after, you're casting to it, and being able to, put a little tiny fly in the corner of their mouth or wherever, where you hook them is pretty incredible. And one of the new developments is Aiden has been tying flies, like I said, since he was right around 9 years old. He's 17 now, so 8 years later, and that's pretty, to catch fish off the flies that your son ties, because I don't tie flies. That's just something I haven't, probably a hobby I don't need, just because of how limited my time is, but it's just something that I never really enjoyed doing or really started to be completely fair. But to catch fish on flies that your son tied is pretty awesome. It's making me think I should try to tie a few flies. He's been doing it way longer than I have.
That's as good as it gets. And I think too, like fishing patterns that you tie yourself or that Aiden ties or whatever the case is, like you're using a pattern that those fish don't see all the time. And I know, Montana is popular like Colorado is popular. And in a lot of these rivers and streams, you have your patterns that you buy at the fly shop, but everybody has those in their box. All the guides are using them. And so when you can just put a different twist on it or a different style on it, sometimes it just seems like it lights those fish up, and so he's been honing his skills, I bet, and it's like it's a fun endeavor to tie those flies and then put your unique signature on it and then try to think like a fish. Think of movement in the fly, think of colors, what it's doing in the water, hold it up to the sky, look at the silhouette. Like, it's a really fun process.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that he has put a lot of like focus in, is having his own signature look. Like one of the famous fly shops here is Charlie's Fly Box, and he has that Charlie's Misa shrimp that is famous, across anyone that nymph fishes, and that fly, like Aiden really, really enjoys putting his little touch on things, and I'm starting to see like a lot of guys, we were using like a rubber leg leech, and it was so funny because the way that he tied it, that was like the go-to. Usually you'll catch them off an egg pattern or something small, like, a little 22 RS2 or something like that, or WD, and all the big leeches that he tied, because of the rubber legs that he's putting together, he puts a little flash on them. We were just crushing them. I was like, okay, all right, maybe there is something to this.
Man, how cool. Yeah, the movement of those flies just make all the difference, and leg color and contrast to the body. It's such a neat process. You're right, as it takes so much time, and I love to tie and spent a lot of time doing it. But yeah, as I get busier and busier, I get away from the vice, and I've really got to dedicate myself this winter to up in my fly box and getting all those patterns tied that I like, and getting creative with it as well. And I do like buying patterns also, that I can try out, but there's something so rewarding about tying your own patterns. So that's saying something when you're catching them on egg patterns and little midge patterns, really small stuff, and Aiden can tie this leech that's got this movement to it, that's saying something, to catch some fish off that, something that those fish aren't standardly eaten.
For sure. And that's one of the things that, that tailwater over there, because a lot of people, depending on who you ask, they're like, well, all those fish have been caught, or whatever, the case is. And they feel that going into a spot like that where you're combat fishing, so to speak, to me, it becomes more challenging. I think a lot of those fish, salmon, they start getting a little bit more lethargic, and, because again, they're going up to die, and DOW, they catch as many as they can, and then they'll hand them out I don't know, they have these appointed days that if you want salmon, you can't actually take anything from those waters, individually, but they do have days when they'll, use some nets, and they get these salmon and they hand them out to people that really, really want them. We primarily just do catch and release unless we're up at some high mountain lakes. But I think that once you start going after like big browns, big cuppos, anything that starts spawning in there, they become really, really tough because they're educated. And it's just, to me, it's like elk hunting, in the sense that once you start educating, like a fish or, an animal, to me, that, they see something 1,000 times because it's getting put in front of their face or whatever. Unless you fell hook them or something like that, to really catch them or hook them in the mouth can become a challenge. If you're not on top of it, especially when you start fishing those colder seasons, because it's incredible that they can see what they can see. But you got to make sure that your skill set's on point.
Absolutely. Yeah, same thing around here, just with these high pressure rivers. I don't know how intelligent a trout is, but I think they really hone their instincts of what food is, and I think they also, they're on different feeding times. I know in the summer months and late summer they're really keyed into the hatches, and unless that hatch is going off, those fish just won't eat those bugs. They're just tight-lipped, or I'll find that they'll sit in those big deep runs throughout the day in that cold water, and they'll just sit and hang there, but they're not looking to eat. They slide over into the feeding slots in the evening when the bugs start coming off the trees and the branches, and then that's when you can catch one. So they do hone their instincts, and that fishing pressure seems to really sharpen it. So yeah, I understand completely where you're coming from. How big do those salmon get in that run, Santino?
Well, you can catch them anywhere from, I think your average one's going to be in that 14 to 16 range. But we've pulled a few out. Like I caught one on Saturday that was like 23 inches. He was awesome.
Oh, wow.
It was great. Yeah, he had a big old kype, on his jaw. It was just, it was a male, and but the bigger salmon, they're smart. They're in those deeper pockets, those deeper holes, and they always find a way to put themselves where when you're looking, like you have to get, I would say that those bigger fish that are more intelligent, in my mind, just because, they're big for a reason, they've been eating good, but they put themselves in a run to where, like, as a fisherman, when you're throwing a line in there, depending on what your setup is, it's real, you have to be making perfect casts, to get your flies to drop down right in front of them, because again, they literally can just move in and out a few inches, open their mouth, and let the food just slip right in. And that's essentially what you're trying to do, right? When you're nymphing, you're just trying to put those flies right in front of them where they'll open their mouth, and then you can set the hook. And when we do this, we've taken on, I think over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of more tight line where we don't use indicators anymore. Everything we do is very, we'll put like a big egg pattern or something on, and that's usually like our indicator. We're seeing those flies go right through, and then it's crazy. People, I think that we're nuts, or we're just full of what. But with polarized glasses and technology nowadays, I've trained my eyes to, and even with Aiden, it's incredible watching him. But he'll call it out. He'll be like, that fish is opening his mouth. Okay, set the hook. Because he brought a buddy that's never caught a fish, and that was the one thing that I was trying to get on film. I wasn't able to, but I'll watch him, and he does the same thing that, like the way I taught him, like watch that fish, watch him move. Okay, look at the corner of his mouth where you think his mouth is, and once you see that white, he's opening it up, set your hook. And that's when he figured that out, and it's kind of an instinctual way of fishing in my opinion, but it's we don't have to use indicators because we can actually see the fish that we're casting to. It definitely makes it harder, but it's way more fun because it's just a little bit more intimate. You're actually watching that fish, watching for movement, and then setting that hook on instinct. And it's pretty awesome when you pull up a fish like that, and it's something that you've trained yourself to do.
Yeah, that presentation is so important. It almost trumps the pattern. We talked earlier about patterns and movement and things, but that presentation of getting that fly to that fish and getting it down is so important. That sight fishing, I fish that style that you're talking about when I can see those rainbows in that run. Typically, I run an indicator in like a technical nymph setup with the men's and things of that nature. That tight line nymphing is getting more and more popular, and I can see where it works, and I've definitely used it when I'm sight fishing to those fish because I can even see my bugs in the water and where my drift is. A
Yeah.
lot of times I catch that. And then just like you say, you see that fish move on that bug, or you see that white of that mouth when he opens up, and that's exactly when that fish grabs it, and then that's when you set the hook. And it's definitely more effective doing that. Do you use the same tight line nymphing if you can't see the fish in a run?
I've done it a few times. It's not as successful. Obviously, I try to use like and I'm terrible as when it comes to knowing specifics on a few different things. But a lot of people use the thingamabobbers or like these big heavy indicators, which there's nothing wrong with them. But I've been getting really focused on that like Norwegian yarn that you put on there, and then you put some of that float goo on there that just helps it like stay elevated. And I use colors like black, stuff that's really, really hard to see on the surface of the water, especially when you're getting into these high pressured areas. And reason being is when I fish these deeper pockets, like you said, it becomes really, really difficult to see anything, right? Any flies. And if I have to use an indicator, that's what I'll use. My other choice, as things start to warm up, is I'll put like a really big, like dry hopper or something like that on a different bug that'll be on the surface, just because you never know. You might have a fish come up and try to grab like a grasshopper or something like that. But when I'm using smaller nymphs, I'll use that almost as like a nymph or as my indicator, if you will. I like that style because over the last few years, because of the areas that we fish, when we do fish and there's a lot of pressure, for me, it's just a little bit funner. I've actually caught really big tailwater cut bows on the top, like in middle of the day, like after 10, like if you get a nice warm day and there's a hatch that goes off, like stuff that you wouldn't even think about, like a mouse pattern or something really heavy that'll hold those lower nymphs up, and you'll still get a good drift. Like it's not going to drag that top fly down like on a mouse or a grasshopper. And I've had big fish come up and hit that top one, which technically was my indicator, which was incredible. That's always fun trying it that way. I've just kind of gotten away from the indicators unless I'm doing lake fishing for trout.
Yeah, how cool. I love that dropper setup. That is so effective. And it's wild. Some of those fish will hit that thing on instinct, and I know in the springtime over here we've got some squalla hatches that come off, and so maybe the fish kind of see them as a big squalla or something of that nature. But a lot of times early in the spring, even with snow on the ground, there isn't a hopper for another couple months that's going to happen here. But I notice those fish will hit it on instinct. And same thing with like the Yarny indicator that you're talking about, like fishing an orange Yarny indicator. Sometimes we'll be early on the salmon fly hatch or something, and I'll have a giant fish just explode on my indicator, So that's really smart to be using a hopper or using a fly up top. And it's like fishing these nymphs, it's kind of got the reputation that it's a easier style to fish or an easier way to fish. But it's so technical. Even fishing an indicator, like the stack mends and the way you have to present your drift so the water doesn't pull your line or pull your bugs off the bottom, that I can fish with somebody, or anybody. Like I fish with some of my good buddies, and if you don't have the right presentation, you don't catch fish. And you can have the exact same leader length, the exact same weight, the exact same bugs, and there'll be a guy that catches more fish than you, or I'll be the guy that catches more fish than the other guy, just from that technical nymphing and spending so much time doing it, whether it's and also fishing for steelhead as well on the coast. And these steelhead will go up to 40 inches, and they're within 5 miles of the salt. Like, these things are so hot. But they're a fish of 1,000 casts. You can go days and not even touch one, but you have to continually be doing the right thing, continually be nymphing the right seams, getting your mends in, getting your bugs down, and presenting them to where you think there is a fish, and then all of a sudden they'll light one up. So that technical nymphing, it really is an art. And I think a lot of fly fishermen, I see guys that are dry fly only, and I think there's so many different styles to fish that you kind of guys put themselves in a box, where that's the only style they want to fish. But to be able to be good at nymphing and at dry fly fishing and at streamer fishing, lately I've really got into swinging big streamers, big 2-3 inch streamers, double articulating hooks and fishing olive and white and black. And some of the fish that I'm pulling out of the, I caught more big fish last spring just by committing to that style of fishing, of swinging that or even dead drifting it. You can do really good in the cold winter months with an indicator, and then fishing a big sculpin underneath it or a big streamer underneath it. And I think it really helps our fishing skill when we're able to take these different tactics and then dial them in and then catch fish off them.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And that's, I think it just, teach their own, right? You got the guys that, like for me, I love nymphing just because my opinion is bigger fish hold in lower pockets, and that's, you have to get down low to catch some of those bigger fish depending on what you're doing. And don't get me wrong, we've caught big fish on the surface like I was just telling you about, but then you get the guys that are sold out on the dry fly stuff, and that's fun too. Like when I start dry fly fishing, I kind of move with the seasons. Like right now we're going to start throwing some big streamers here in the next few weeks because the pike are going to start spawning and moving. The waters are getting shallower. Those fish are super aggressive, and it's almost colder the better. I don't think it ever it doesn't get nearly as cold in Colorado as it does up north, like in the, up in Canada and all that kind of stuff. But pike are just such a northern fish that they are just so aggressive, and they are very, very hard on the trout population, especially in some of these lakes that we go to. So right now that's going to be kind of like a big thing on our hit list, is to start popping some big streamers and stripping. And that's something that I started, I wouldn't say I dedicated a ton of time, but last year I spent more time than I ever had before throwing streamers and just, really banging it out, long casts, and just stripping. And I'm really starting to enjoy that. Like you said, it's kind of like I opened up a new box of toys that I can play with, and that's something that we're going to be spending a lot of time here in the next few weeks doing.
Oh, how wild. Yeah, I've got a stream I want to hit that has some northerns in it. So that's good to hear the cold doesn't affect him on the chase. And yeah, it's wild how you start to learn and pick up information. So you talk about throwing that streamer in and then stripping it back in. And then like your angle that you strip it back in, throwing it upstream, you're able to get that bug down farther, where downstream it rides up a little bit more, or that strip pop. And I got that from like those Rapala guys, where you strip and then kind of pop your rod a little bit, strip and pop your rod. And boy, a lot of those fish will eat on the pop. Or like another tactic that I picked up, and I've been fishing streamers for 20 years, but I really dedicated to it. And then fishing with my good buddy Dylan Ness, we were going down in the boat, and he had this style of throwing his streamer that was really effective, and I had never done it before. And what he was doing is he was throwing that thing upstream back behind the boat, which is a known tactic, and then you strip it back and it dives really deep. But what he was doing is he was throwing it upstream, and then he was throwing a big downstream mend in it and then stripping it. And what it was doing is it was pulling that streamer down the whole seam line instead of across the seam line. So he was effectively covering more water in that seam where those fish like to eat it, and he started to get eats immediately. And it took me a while to pick up on it or figure out how he was doing it. I started asking questions, and now, like you were saying, it's another tool in my toolbox of how to throw that streamer and bring it down that seam. But I love how the woods and water just educates us and teaches us, like, experience in failure is the best learning tool we have, but just experience on the water teaches us so much about these fish.
Well, and that's that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, just hearing that story with your buddy, I think that is one of the coolest things. Just like anything that you do, like when you're in the wood, like you start learning bushcraft and you learn how to make a fire a different way, a little bit easier, or whatever it is. And you in regards to fishing, when you're standing potentially in one position for several hours because there's fish right in front of you, you're trying to catch them. It's like the definition of an insanity. Insanity. You can do the same thing and get the same result and just keep trying it over and over. And with fishing, for me, it's one of those things that I've been like, one hole can be completely different than another, depending how the current's running into it, depending what time of day it is. Especially when it's slow. And if you're that good, or you're that talented. It's really just a matter of consistency and just trying, like, not being afraid to try new things. Because I would say I'm very unorthodox. I have buddies that they're devoted fly fishermen. Like, they fish more than they hunt, and I'm opposite. In regards to, like, they live for going to different waters. They travel to different states. Like, they love it. And it's one of those deals that every time I fish with them, they're like, man, you're so unorthodox that you catch fish. And it's like, well, I'm always, and it sounds weird, but, like, I try to pretend like I'm, like, next to my flies underwater. Like, what are they doing? What rocks are they bouncing off of? I look at my line. Did I get hung up in some moss? And just depending on the years and how that looks, I am just always trying to almost visualize what my flies are doing underwater, especially when they've gone by a big fish for, I don't know, 5 or 10 passes, and I still haven't even seen him move or attracted him. So for me, that becomes a challenge, and I get obsessed with that. And I think that's what has given me the success that I've had with being able to catch fish, because I'm not a big recurve guy. I've shot recurve, archery in the past, but my example here is that it's instinctual. When you shoot a compound bow or a rifle or anything like that, there is skill to it, but nowadays with all the technology, if you understand the mechanics of it, you draw back, you put your pin where it's at, you get the same anchor, you're consistent, you can make a pretty tight group. It is not that way with the recurve, and also with the fly fishing rod, it is not that way. You have to make yourself mechanical to be able to throw or cast or roll cast, or be able to drop your flies and do a quick mend up and try to make that consistent. It's really the skills in your wrists and your hands and how you're moving that rod. And that's why I don't be afraid to try new things, because when I'm sitting in a hole for a few hours or whatever it is trying to catch fish, like, that to me is part of the fun and the challenge now. Being able to try different things, imagine what those flies are doing, and then make myself be able to do the same repetitive thing enough before I change methods or change the style of how I'm throwing those flies out.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's changing the tactics, and whether that's changing your bugs, a lot of times I'm changing the presentation. We talked about nymphing, like those steelhead are so technical on the coast that a lot of times you get in a hole and you run a dozen drifts. That if you make a dozen good drifts in a hole, that fish should eat it. That's the way steelhead are. They're aggressive, but if you don't, it's wild how sometimes I won't even change my bugs. You talked about every hole being different. Every run is different in the river. And so a lot of times I'm just changing my leader length or changing my weight to get a better drift. And you read that
Right.
through, the way it's bouncing off the bottom is you want to tick off the bottom, but you don't want to hang up on the bottom. You also don't want to just free float over the top of those fish without touching the bottom. And so being able to read that and then being willing to change things up. And then once you are running good drifts through that hole and you don't get an eat, just change those bugs up and run a different color through there, a different pattern through there. And that's how you really find that epic fishing too, is by changing things up. And it's a fine line. It's a fine line between believing in what you have on and having confidence in it. Like I have 10 patterns that I really believe in, that I fish all the time. It's tough to get away from those patterns sometimes because I know they catch fish, but it's almost like a feeling of just, this isn't working. I'm not going to catch one out of here. I got to change up. I got to find something that is working, something these fish are keyed into, or I've got to change my presentation. I know that I'm not ticking bottom in the bottom of that run, therefore I'm not fishing it effectively. I've got to either stick more weight on, or I've got to lengthen my leader and then run a few drifts through there. And it's amazing how you can just make one of those small changes, and then all of a sudden you can start lighting them up in a hole.
Yeah. And I think that's where I would say this for anybody that listens to this that is just getting into fly fishing or wanting to get into this. Don't be overwhelmed by, we're talking about patterns, and we've already gone over a few different things that for some people that might sound like, gibberish, or in the sense of like it's almost like rocket science. I think fly fishing can be rocket science. And what I try to do is I try to simplify things. Like when I first started and I started learning from some of these guys that were just incredible, amazing fishermen, they they knew everything and why they were doing what they would do. You kind of have to find something that works and play like what you just said, Brian, talking about changing your lead or your weight, but do not get complacent, because you literally could just sit there and be in a spot for 4 or 5 hours, and if everyone around you is catching fish and you're not catching fish, then you need to change something up. Or if there's one guy out there catching fish and you're not, that might be a good guy to talk to after he's done fishing or he's gotten out of his hole, so you're not interrupting his time, just to pick his brain. So that was something that I've never been afraid of, as far as asking questions and trying to learn, but also not being afraid to like trust myself and say, okay, well, I'm going to add another weight, or I'm going to change this, or I'm going to put a different bottom fly, where you're not having to redo your entire setup, because that's one of the growing pains with fishing, that if you're spending all your time undoing wind knots or tying on a new end, I've seen a lot of people just quit and say, hey, this isn't for me. So but it's one of those things that if you really, really want it, just don't be afraid to try new things, and you don't have to change out everything, but just make small adjustments. And I think that's what people miss. They think, oh, I got to change my entire setup. I don't think you can ever go wrong on the tailwater with having an egg on the top. Maybe it's just a couple of the bottom flies, or the bottom fly that you're using if you're running a 2 or 3 fly setup, that you might just want to change out, to where it's not as painful, or it's not as daunting for some people just to change out one fly versus having to change out their entire setup. So don't be afraid to make small changes, is my point. And like with adding weight, changing the bottom fly, and then even just moving your position and how you're casting, and trying to think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, you're right. Just changing that bottom fly, and it's paying attention to what's going on around you. If you're floating in a drift boat and you're catching fish off your bottom fly but nothing off your top fly, I'm more apt to change it up when we stop the boat, and I'll change that front fly up. It's like, okay, my trailer fly's catching them, but I haven't got anything off my lead bug. I'm going to change my lead bug up, and just trying to key into what those fish are eating and how they're eating it. And I love, like in these Montana streams up where I'm at, I love having a big lead fly that hunts for fish. And so, I'll dead drift even when I'm nymphing a small sculpin. I fish a lot of like stone flies or rubber legs, and then also leeches as well as that lead fly. And then I'll go smaller on the back fly. And that lead fly sure seems to hunt for big fish as you're going down the river. But I think you're exactly right. Is being willing to make those small changes and adjustments through the day, and the fish are going to teach you what they want to eat and what they don't want to eat. If you're getting strikes on one of those things, they're liking that bug but not liking the lead fly, or whatever the case is, your setup. And I also think that paying attention to where the fish are laying. Like I can fish, this home river of mine that I live on is the Madison River, and it's a blue ribbon trout stream, but there's a lot of guys that fish it, but it can be different day to day where the fish are holding. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that as well. Are they sitting in that flat water, on the bank lines, or are they sitting off the drop off? Are they sitting behind the rocks, or sometimes they'll be sitting in front of the rocks? And so paying attention to where you're throwing and where you're getting hookups, you can start to almost dial in your process. And, I don't like to overthink it as well. Like I like to get in that flow state when I'm throwing that fly to the banks or to the runs where, you're tossing it on the seam or you're tossing it up and in, and really feeling that drift and feeling that run. It's when I'm fishing my best, but I'm definitely paying attention to where those fish are eating it and how they're eating it. And if I can key into that, I can catch a lot more fish.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's just not, if you start becoming lazy and just start throwing a line, then that, the day's pretty much over. You have to be emotionally invested. You have to have focus in what you're doing, what your fly's doing. And then, as soon as you get one and that you use that method, and then it's like, okay, you have to become mechanical and repeat what you just did. Then that's when it really becomes fun. And I think a lot of people think, well, I'm just throwing this line out. They're not, a lot of people throw their lines out that are novice fishermen, and I've seen them, like they forget that mend up little little quick things, or even like if you're fishing flows that are even higher, depending on how your current's going, like mending it a few times up, you might need to do that just to get that right drift. And I think a lot of people miss that, just from what I've seen, because then your leader and everything starts dragging your flies and it's just blowing by the fish every time. It's like, I don't get it. Your flies are doing the same thing as mine. It's like, not really. You're moving by at 75 miles per hour and I'm only going by at like 20. That's why they're sitting there long enough to allow that fish to eat it. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people miss.
Oh, you're spot on. Again, back to that presentation. And you'll catch fish 10-1 to the other guy that isn't getting those multiple mends in, and he can mend it once or even mend it twice. But every hole is different, every seam is different, every run is different. So as those are coming down, sometimes it's constant maintenance of throwing those mends in there and getting it in there. And they're technical mends where you can whip your line above that indicator, but it doesn't pull the indicator out of the water. It doesn't pull your flies off the bottom. And so, yeah, just that technique. And I know, like, fishing streamers a lot. Like, I swing for steelhead a lot with big weighted lines and things. And you can change up the weighted lines, and then you can change up the angle of the swing. But when I first started doing it for trout, I was not that effective. And I hadn't caught too many of them that way. And so it's taken like really honing my skills, which weighted line I need in which run, the angle at which I throw it, where I hold my rod tip, it all plays a factor in it. And once you can start to dial that in, now on a really popular river that I'm fishing quite a bit, like, I can swing that streamers, and nobody's really using that spey rod swinging those streamers in the giant deep holes. And so now I've got this technique that nobody's using, and they may throw streamers out of the boat and retrieve them, which is highly effective, but they can't get down in those big, deep runs where now I can take my spey rod with a weighted tip, and now I've got my style of throwing out, I've got my angle, I've got my swing. I know that, I want to tick bottom every now and again, and now it's highly effective. But it's taken me, a whole season or two of really committing myself to that and not catching fish a lot. But now the payoff is those giant 22 to 25 inch fish that nobody's catching, because nobody's running that presentation. It's just something different, something unique, like thinking outside the box. And fishing really lends itself to outside the box thinking.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're spot on with that. And that's one of the things that for Colorado, there's not a ton of big water. There's a few places that are, but like when you're trying, a lot of these tailwater pockets that we're finding now that we're moving into winter, you're not having to travel as far. I think that's one of the things where we'll go do a trip like in late March in Wyoming, go up to the reef and do the Miracle Mile and all that. And I really, really wanted to put a trip together where we can go up to the Bighorn. And I love the drift style boat, approach. That's something that for me to be able to go catch really, big fish, or even be able to pull the boat off and then, wade in or whatever it is that you have to do, that we just don't get a ton of that here in Colorado. And I know that we've done rivers like, the Colorado here in, well, I would say like in the summer months, but you really don't want a drift boat on there unless you're a great boatsman, because there's so many rocks and there's people that run that. You really need more of a raft type, like a catamaran or something like that. You need to be sitting on something that's rubber. You don't want to be sitting on a drift boat, because we've done it before and literally almost ruined a $5,000 boat.
Oh, that is gnarly, man. And gnarly water with the drift boat, that is sketchy.
Well, and that's the thing. My buddy John, who I fish with, he's one of the best fishermen I know. He brought that up because he said, well, it's Colorado. I think there'll be a few sketchy spots. We had to pull over, have one of our friends who used to do some whitewater guiding get in that boat, and it was incredible to see how he dodged some of those rocks. But if we would have been in it, we may have went overboard, or because the water was just, they were borderline class 3 into 4 rapids. It shouldn't have been in that drift boat. In that kind of water. And the thing that I've always been infatuated with in Montana, where it's big sky country, but you also have just some incredible rivers, and down in that southeastern part right there where the Bighorn is, that's some incredible country. And it looks like a fisherman's paradise, especially if you had a good drift boat to be on.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it's a great tool for out west here. But, you know, we've got great systems that are great big systems like the Missouri or the Yellowstone, Big Hole, and then, you know, intermediate water, which is, you know, like the Madison and Big Hole and Beaverhead, you know, rivers of that size. And then we've got these small streams, and a lot of these smaller streams are untouched. These smaller streams that you can get like a single man watercraft down, but there's no put-ins or takeouts for a drift boat, or it's not a big enough stream for a drift boat, but we use those single man crafts to get down those. And there can be just as big a browns in those small streams as there can the big streams, and it's really low pressure. And so I've had fun going down these small streams with a hopper rod and then also a streamer rod, and I seem to go about 50-50 on fish, like but it's such fun fishing. So you got to bring Aiden up. We got to put together a trip up north here where we can take my boat and go fish a bunch of these streams, man. It'd just be an absolute riot.
Yeah, well, likewise, if you have time in late January, we fish a couple tailwaters that are the thing that is in our advantage is that it's cold. And there's a lot of people that do not want to be out. Like, we fish some canyons where you'll see, every time we're in there, we'll see bighorns, and that's super fun. They'll cross the river right in front of you, which is incredible. You'll be fishing, and you just see these bighorn sheep coming through in these small, like, herds of, 5 to 10. And they're
cool.
just in. So it's fun, but you only have about, on a good, perfect blue sky day, you only have maybe about 4.5 hours of light in there. Everything else, you're in the shadow. So even if it's nice and warm, it's still cold because you're in these canyons. You got, 2 to 3 feet of snow on the banks. And what's crazy is you're only fishing, I think even on the deepest end, maybe 3 foot of water. But there's these shallows that a lot of people overlook. They walk by fish all the time. And, these shallows are only probably maybe about a foot, and in some cases less. And you might have a 24-inch bow that's just sitting right there that just came off a red, or a male that's sitting behind, waiting for a female to drop some eggs so he can eat those up. And they are just sitting right there first thing in the morning. And a lot of people, because of the shadows, if you're not wearing the right, shade of polarized glasses, it can be tough to see them. But it's a really, really fun time. But again, you just got to embrace the cold, which I know that cold is a second wife to you. So you're more than welcome to come out and endure that with us. But it's super fun because when you catch these fish, you kind of have to let your hands de-thaw for about 5 minutes after you land it, because we've been out there in temps that were single digits. And I don't know what the water is, but when you put your hands in there and you take a picture with fish, it's like it's hard to even move them because they get so freaking cold.
Oh my gosh, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's so painful. Yeah, we got to make a trip happen either up here or down there. But yeah, we get some of that same wintertime fishing, and I really feel like it's a local season. And I wish I could fish more in the fall. I'm kind of like you, where I spend the majority of my time hunting. But just talked to one of my buddies yesterday, and he's been floating and turning some really nice fish on streamers. It's really starting to get on these rivers. So I'm going to try to make a few days work this fall. But I love that winter season when it's cold like that. Nobody's out, and you can really target these bigger fish out there. But you're right, it is so tough to get a picture of one, or even just to release a fish. The moment you touch that water, your hands get cold. And then I think the worst part is when your hands are warming up. So they get that cold and they hurt. But then when they start to warm up, that buzz or needles feeling in your hands when they start to warm, when you're on the edge of frostbite on your hands, that is so dang painful. Gosh, that's tough to take.
Yeah, well, that's where at least for me, Aiden's not there yet, but Pendleton kind of helps me out. That's my ibuprofen when I'm out there, Pendleton whiskey.
Oh, that's smart. Yeah. Warms you from the inside.
That's right. I was going to ask you, though, so your buddy that's fishing right now, and he's throwing these streamers, is it the brown spawn right now?
Yeah, so we're just coming into our brown spawn right now. It's actually not yet. It happens more kind of late November, early December, but just the pressure gets off the rivers, and then these big browns, they just turn on streamers on the fall. They're looking for a really big meal. There's not many boats on the water, and so he's been putting on. He talked about a fish that He had a client eat down in the evening hole, this hole that we know down from Burnt Tree, and he said he had the biggest fish eat, but he said his client had gloves on, and his gloves got wrapped around in the line, and he said it was an absolute shit show, and they ended up losing the fish, but he said it was a great big one. But yeah, these browns are getting real aggressive now, and they're looking for big meals. So they're ready to go into the spawn, but they're all colored up with these yellows and oranges and reds, and it's those big aggressive fish that are 20-inch plus. So yeah, it's just awesome fishing right now. So I've got to get out.
Yeah, browns to me are that they're almost like the elk of the fish species when it comes to trout, depending on where you fish, because when you see a big cutbow or like a salmon, they're bright red. You're looking for these strips, and when I'm trying to judge a fish that I'm looking at in a hole, like if you see a fish that you see a red strip that looks like it's over, anywhere over 12 inches plus, then you're like, okay, that's a 25, 24-inch bow, like without a doubt, like that's going to be a really, really good fish. And that's what I look for, because you get, right behind, where their gills are at, all the way almost, into the tail, you can see that surface on the body. But with browns, I don't want to say it scares you, but it's almost like a shock, like almost like a back tension hinge release on a bow. Like it almost surprises you when you get a brown, especially when they're spawning, how hard and aggressive they hit. It reminds me of like the first time I went to Wyoming, and I went to Gray's Reef with my buddy John I was telling you about earlier. We went up there and we were catching 18, 19, 20-inch, cut bows that were, they were spawning. But the thing that blew me away is like an 18-inch fish felt like a 30 or 25-inch fish in comparison to what we catch here in Colorado in regards to the fight. I just couldn't believe how wild those fish were. It was just, and that's why I love catching browns, because they just fight so hard. They're very, and they're so aggressive, and the hardest thing is they are so hard to see, like in the water. I've seen them, like real big ones, but where we fish, there's a lot of sand bottoms, like the stream that I'm telling you about. There's not a lot of rocks or structure. There is and there isn't, but where those fish hold, they hold on like these little bottoms where there's like a lot of soft dirt. And I don't want to say it's impossible, but they're really, really challenging to see unless you have the right light. And that's why I think catching those is super special.
Oh yeah, it's speaking to my heart. I love targeting those great big brown trout. I love the colors on them, the fight of them. Yeah, I just love catching those big ones. We've got, I mentioned that Missouri earlier. And the Missouri is this giant stream that runs into the Mississippi and then, runs east into the Atlantic Ocean. But this Missouri is such a big water, and they've got a section of it with a handful of lakes. And these lakes allow these browns to really grow up. And so right now, I got to take my teepee over and go camp out and then go fish for these things in the Missouri. But it's an honest place where you can catch a 10-pound brown, where you can catch a 30-inch fish. And I think my best over there is 26, but I've seen my buddies catch a 34, a 30 over there, and you actually see these fish porpoise out in front of you. So they're coming up to spawn up these systems, and you'll actually see a 30-inch fish porpoise out in front of you, and they're really tough to catch. There's a lot of guys doing it. Guys are using center pin rigs, single hand rods, but mostly we're using spey rods. And a lot of times I like to swing streamers with the spey rod, but over there for these fish, we're using like a technical nymphing style. And so we'll use a spey rod, like a 6-7 weight spey rod, even up to an 8 weight spey rod. And then we'll use an indicator setup with a 8 to 10 foot leader, depending on water depth. And then we'll throw that thing out there, and then it's wild when you have a 12.5 foot rod, how much more you can manage that drift way out in front of you. And instead of getting, 100-foot drift, you can get a 300-foot drift really effective for these big fish. But it is so fun because when you hook into one of these things, I mean, you're into the giant brown trout that you've dreamt about your whole entire life, and he's right there all colored up and big kipes, and it's a really fun river to fish. So I've got to make sure that I get over there. I've got one muley tag for November, but if I'm not muley hunting, I'm going to be fishing that spot, looking for my magical 30-incher because they live in there.
Sure. Well, now I don't know, aside from how fun this podcast has been, I think it's going to cost me dropping some money on a spey rod and devoting some time to that, because like I'm thinking, like, in just what you were talking about just a second ago with it, you get that added value that other people on the river might not have because you're able to, drop stuff down with that weighted tip and really put it down in there deep. There's a few holes that I'm already thinking about in the winter if I had something like that, because there's a few pockets that you'll see 30 plus inch bows on some of these tailwaters, and they're in, some of these holes can be, 5 feet, 5.5, almost 6 feet deep, and having something like that might be the ticket to really pulling them out, because there are a few guys that do it. I haven't actually been there to witness them doing it because you just see pictures of these monsters, but they like holding in those deep holes, and some of these fish are just absolutely incredible. Like getting one just on the rod and even just getting a fight for a few minutes would be, reward enough, but trying to land one would be incredible.
Oh, you're spot on. You're spoken like a true fisherman. Like once you get a spey rod in your hands, and I started using them for steelhead, but once you get the idea of it and how effective they are, all of a sudden you think about all these spots that you can use that spey rod. You think about spots with salmon flies and hoppers where it's like, oh, I could throw it off that bridge piling and get a drift there. Or you think about those big deep runs that nobody can really fish off a single hand rod, but now you can reach it with that double hander, and you can fish longer leader lengths. Like you can fish a leader length that's about a foot longer than your rod or so. But I know I take my big 10 weight 15 footer over to like the main fork of the Clearwater that will run 20,000 CFS, and you can catch steelhead in there that nobody can catch on a single hand rod. You can just fish a longer leader, you can fish deeper water, you can fish bigger water, and so it's a real advantage. So yeah, we got to get together and fish these spey rods, whether it's up here north or down where you're at, and just have a couple of them rigged up. And it's a really fun way to cast too. Like the cast on those spey rods, like you can almost just get immersed in the cast of those things, but you almost feel like a wizard because it's all done with this water line loading. Like all of a sudden you just whip this line around, and everybody has this you can make your own style of fishing, but it's all done with this water loading of your line. You don't need any back cast. You can throw everything in front of you and then throw a big D loop and huck that thing across the river farther than you could ever toss a single hander, and so the
That's
cast
crazy.
on it and the mend on it is so fun that when you first start out, you're not even really looking to catch a fish. You're just looking to make a good cast and a good drift with that thing. But it's a really fun way to fish. Yeah, I think you would absolutely dig it.
And then I'm sure after you learn how to do that, you get a single hand rod. It's just, you can just do it in your sleep. Like everything just becomes a lot more easier or less than, when you're doing it with the spey rod, I would imagine.
That's exactly right. As you pick up those spey casts and that water loading, and then all of a sudden you'll have your single hand rod, and it just gives you more techniques to use. If you don't have the chance to back cast, and like you talked about roll casting earlier, a lot of this is similar to roll casting, but all of a sudden, you can transpose those techniques that you've learned with your spey rod to your single hand rod, and you just command control of a single hand rod. It makes you way better at a single hand casting and gives you some more techniques to use, that you can kind of water load that line and throw it out there. And they're actually making like those switch rods now, which are like you can cast them single hand or double hand, and then you can get these switch lines, and they're loaded up. The line is loaded to be able to spey cast, or you can single hand cast it. But the majority of times now, when I get a single hand rod in my hands, I'm pretty much spey casting it and water loading it to throw it where I need to. So it does make your single hand game way better.
Yeah, that's way cool. Yeah, when I first started this area that I'm telling you about, just south of the Dream Stream, we were fishing some lake banks where fish would hold and spawn in the springtime, and it's so windy there. You don't even say the word wind when you show up to this place. And I think the first few trips that I went, probably several hours just undoing wind knots, and not like consecutive, but just because of the wind. Every other cast, I feel like I get a wind knot, and it really, you have to weather that if you want to, be good at it. But at the time it sucked and I was getting super frustrated. But as time went on, that is really what taught me how to cast across rivers, learning how to double haul, really learning how to let your line load. And that is, again, I don't ever try to, claim that I'm an expert, but when I want to put a line or fly somewhere because of those growing pains that I went through, it just made it, a lot more simpler. And I've seen guys that have, with spey rods, and it is like an art. That to me, that's something that it's been on the back of my mind, but hearing you talk about it, I'm getting excited about it. I think I need to drop some money on a spey rod and that setup and learn how to do it. To me, it would even be fun because we do a lot of springtime lake fishing, and you're pulling streamers. You want to be down low, and this one of the lakes I was talking about, Spinney. You get on these boats and you're out there. If you can anchor in 4 to 6 feet of water, you're fishing all these fish that have been, the ice came off. They're in these big groups, and then what's on the outside of them? There's pike everywhere hunting these fish. So you're pretty much putting yourself right in the hunting grounds. And like when you're on a lake, I'm not saying that you can't mess up with the fly rod because we've done it, but you can cast any which way you want and you can bang it out wherever you want, and that's what makes it super fun. But that would be a good tactic to even try out there because I've never seen a guy on one of these lakes throwing a spey rod, and that might be one of the new things for next year when we go out on the lake. Do that too.
Yeah, I think you'll dig it. Yeah. It's you talked about casting in the wind and double hauling. You're right, it teaches us, and then we can use those tactics elsewhere, but that being able to put your fly where you want it, you just catch more fish. When you can make a drift on the far side run, or you can reach stuff that other guys can't reach, and it's through like this creative casting too. Everybody's standing in that spot, but once you learn command over your line, with a good double haul or, with good roll cast, all of a sudden you can fish water that nobody else can reach. And that double haul, that is tough to teach to somebody. You almost have to dedicate yourself to it. And I thought I knew how to double haul until I went to the Salt. And then I went to the Salt and fishing with buddies down there. I mean, they want you to double haul, but you got to double haul that thing down to your feet. It really takes that line movement all the way down to really chuck against that coastal wind that's out there, those ocean winds to be able to make your cast. And like you say, you have growing pains just like you had in that windy spot where I had it on the Salt where I could not get that fly where I wanted to, but through multiple days of throwing that thing, you start to pick it up and start to get better at it. And then when I start fishing, our home waters, and, I love chasing the salmon fly hatch is by far one of my favorite times of the year as I take time, and you guys have salmon flies down there as well. We have them go off on about 3 or 4 different rivers. Usually our water's high from runoff that time of year. The fish are in the banks. It's really technical, throwing that big dry fly in the brush, under the brush, getting these technical drifts down. But the biggest fish in the water are hunting for these bugs. And so it's so fun, but it's that high pressure cast. So you got one chance to get it on the bank in the right spot, get your mens and get a drift down there to see if he'll eat it. And what really made me better at that was that Salt and learning that big double haul to where now I can just command that salmon fly exactly where I want it, whether it's windy or not. You get that fly where it is. And I had a day on the big hole this past year where we just absolutely killed him. It was like the payoff day. You go 10 days and you kind of get them okay here and there, and then you get that one day that's just magical where they're all eating it, the bugs are going off, and that day it was extremely windy. But, I was able to catch, my best trout of the year, like this 24-inch colored up brown, because I had that double haul technique, could get that fly where I needed to in extremely windy conditions, and the fishing was off the hook. So, yeah, there's just it's such a fun endeavor, isn't it? Like where you can just keep learning. It's like this ever evolving learning curve or learning circle where you keep gaining knowledge and picking up different techniques and honing your instincts, and then that comes to fruition when you get one of those good days of fly fishing. It's why I love fly fishing and why I love bow hunting, is that you never stop learning or stop developing your techniques or knowledge. I'm 40 years old and I'm still learning every day I'm out there.
Yeah, well, and it comes through just hearing you talk about it because we've talked on some hunting stuff too, but just just hearing your passion and, just kind of getting to know you. I've known who, well, I think the first time I heard your name was because of Lane Walter. We were on my Dull Sheep hunt in Alaska, and I think you were up there. He was talking to you or something like that, or going back and forth on text. But yeah, he just said Brian's like one of the most knowledgeable guys you'll ever meet. But you find that guys that are knowledgeable, it's because they have that mentality that you do, and I would say that I do. It's the more I learn, the less I know, and it's one of those things that even when I was just fishing with Aiden and my younger son Jaron and Cassandra, my wife, we were out there just this past weekend. It still blows me away sometimes when you see these little tiny flies floating in front of a fish, and then especially with the method that we're using right now, where we're going, we're not using an indicator. It just blows me away that you can get such a small hook on a magnificent creature, and being able to feel that on your line, land the fish, release them, all that kind of stuff. It's just it's unbelievable. And you think about how they had to do it back in the day with the spear, or how they used to catch fish, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And we're just so lucky that where things have evolved. And even then, it's still hard. It's not like we're it's not like we're just going out there catching every single time. But it is fun learning it, and it's just it's something fun to do with your time, other than get caught up in a lot of stuff that this world's some of the things that we're going in now. And it's a great break for stress and all the other stuff that comes with the added value of just being in the outdoors.
Oh, it's the best. Yeah, you talked about those bighorn sheep in the canyon, and you talked about when we first started seeing all the elk and deer running over to your fishing spot. It is that. It's a reset for us guys, to be able to go out and immerse ourselves in the outdoors. And I'm happiest when I'm immersed in one of these challenges of trying to figure out a fish and trying to catch him. When I'm on the water for 8-10 hours, that's all I'm thinking about. And so, all of a sudden, all my stress or all my normal day worries just go by the wayside, and I just I feel lighter when I'm done. I feel better. I think it soothes the soul, and it's why I love it, and I know it's why you love it as well. And man, I have really enjoyed getting to know you. I'm gonna hit up Aiden. I want to get him on the podcast for a conversation with his fly tying and everything he's got going on. But
Sure.
I have really enjoyed getting to know you and have an in-depth conversation about fly fishing and about hunting. Man, you're absolutely killing it, and I'm so happy that you're passing this on to the next generation. That we've got a new generation that's up and coming that are going to be, they're going to be better than we are, because we were able to pass on our information to them at a younger age, and they progress so much quicker. They're smart, they pick it up, and they love it. And so man, I just can't thank you enough for being on the podcast, and then also passing on what we love to the next generation.
Well, thanks for having me on, and I appreciate it. Likewise, feelings mutual, and we'll look forward to the next conversation for sure.
All right. Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks.
All right, guys, that's a wrap. Man, I just love connecting with these guys on the podcast. Just hearing what's out there and what different places this nation has to offer. So, again, he was from Colorado, and talking about fly fishing for the salmon was really fun, and then just some of his trout opportunities there, and some of the different streams that they fish. So it's just great to connect with like-minded people, and really excited to get him on the podcast. So thanks to Santino for taking the time and being on. Man, I really appreciate it. Again, our sponsor for today's show is Avid Max. You can get 10% off if you put in the promo code Eastmans10 at checkout. Again, absolutely everything for fly fishing on there. Have things for camping, apparel, all the top name brands. Make sure to check them out at avidmax.com. And with that, man, I'm excited to get after some fishing here. Hunting season kind of took over for the fall. I meant to get more days in, but I've just been so busy back and forth. But I'm excited. There's some guys catching some really good browns right now, and it's a good time of the year for all that streamer fishing that I preach. whether throwing it on a single hand rod or a double hand rod or whatever it is. But it's just a great time of year. I like to think of it as a local season too, as there's not a lot of guiding. There's not a lot of guys that are out there in the cold, fishing for these big trout, and so you get a lot more of the river to yourself. So it's what I really enjoy. I'm gonna fish hard here for the rest of fall. I got some good spots for November, December, and then all the way into winter and into spring. Absolutely love it. So I'm excited to get back after it. I've had all my rods out and taking care of my gear and reorganizing and just getting ready. I would have been out this weekend, but we had like it was -20 with the wind chill or something stupid like that. It was too cold to cast a fly for me, but it's supposed to warm back up in the 50s this week. So I'm hoping to get a couple evenings this week and go get after them. So I'll let you guys know how I do. Hopefully you just see a great big picture come across your feed on social media. But it'll just be fun to get out and just hear the beats of the water, just casting again. It's like a meditative state to be out fly fishing and thinking of that river and being in that river. It's so quiet, so peaceful. Man, I just love it. So I can't wait to get back out there. I've got some good ideas on new rivers to fish and things I want to accomplish here. So I'm going to be getting after it and recording some great podcasts and releasing those to you guys. God, I've got some great ones I've been recording and guests I've been lining up. So I want to continue to bring you guys that next level information to get you into more fish or to find that new system or whatever the case is. But entertain you, like whatever you get out of this podcast, but just be at my very best and bring you guys the best content I can. So I really appreciate all the support. Appreciate Santino for being on the podcast, and I'll catch up with you guys next week.